I'm David Knowles, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we bring you the latest updates from Ukraine, discuss Russia's T-14 Armata tank, and we do a deep dive with special guests into the view from South Asia. How are countries like Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh reacting to a war far to their west, and what does that mean for the region as a whole?
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
This hideous and barbaric venture of Vladimir Putin must end in failure.
We need a military strategy for Ukraine to gain a decisive advantage on the battlefield, to win the war.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
Every weekday afternoon, we sit down with leading journalists from the Telegraph's London newsroom and our teams reporting on the ground to bring you the latest news and analysis on the war in Ukraine. It's Tuesday, the 25th of April, 1 year and 60 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today I'm joined by our Associate Editor Dominic Nichols, Assistant Comment Editor Francis Durnley, the Telegraph's South Asia correspondent Joe Wallen, and journalist Tushar Shetty. Joe and Tushar are joining us from their new venture, the Beyond the Indus podcast, that looks at South Asian politics, explaining the region to listeners from the rest of the world. I started by asking Dom for the latest news from Ukraine.
Well, hi, David. Hi, everybody. So let's start, if I may, with Ukraine getting its citizens out of Sudan, the airlift that's going on at the moment. Number of international countries, number of different countries all attempting now in this lull, and I think it's a lull rather than a ceasefire in Sudan to get their people out. The main intelligence director of Ukraine's defence ministry have said on Telegram this morning that they've got 138 people out, 87 of their own citizens, I think some Georgians, some Peruvians as well, out to Egypt, 138 in total. They've not said how they did it, which would be interesting to see, but they're saying all their 87 citizens that most employed in the aviation industry from reports are out. There, just as an aside, there's a lot happening at the moment after this US brokered quote unquote ceasefire. Like I say, it seems to be holding at the moment, but all the others have collapsed. So this 72-hour window is probably more like 48 hours, and we're already well over 12 hours into that. So we shall see. There's an RAF C-130 Hercules, a Fat Albert, in the air at the moment, heading north out of Sudan back to Cyprus. So the British airlift is underway. But that'll be all over the press later. You'll be able to see that. Back to Ukraine. So in the country, in Kupiansk. So now we are about 80 k's east of Kharkiv, so the northeast of the country. A local history museum was hit by shelling overnight, at least one dead and 10 injured, although they're expecting to find people, or maybe bodies under the rubble that's left there. President Zelensky wrote, "The terrorist country is doing everything to destroy us completely, our history, our culture, our people." We've got a video on our website, but you'll see it elsewhere on social media, that the place is totaled. Again, no military targets there or nearby by the look of it, and it's difficult to see that this isn't a continuation of that effort to erase culture, but I'll let you make the judgment on that. Elsewhere, there are reports from Russia, albeit pro-Russian Telegram channels, that are saying that Russian troops are using anti-thermal blankets to hide from drones. So basically blankets that retain your heat or do not allow the heat of the human body to escape and therefore be visible to thermal cameras. Now, this is obviously, as you can imagine, of more use to those in more static positions, so either sniper teams or once you've gone firm in a position and you're dug in for the night, if you like. If you're running around and in the assault or doing any kind of other activity of loading supplies or running a gun line, then these things aren't really going to do an awful lot, because if you're moving, you will break the seal and you'll give off heat. But yes, I mean, they are there. These things do work. They are out there. But like I say, they're large blankets you've got to sort of hide underneath, and like some sort of Harry Potter cloak. So if you are in a more mobile unit, they are not so good. I mean, this technology, trying to hide people and trying to mask the hot engine signature from ground vehicles and also aircraft. I mean, this has been around for years, trying to mask that signature. You know, the Mark 9 Alpha Lynx that we had in Afghanistan that used to blow the hot engine, the exhaust from the engine up into the rotor blades to disperse that heat signature. That's the sort of latest wizard wheeze. But it's very tricky to hide the temperature of one's body, let alone the equipment. Radios get hot, batteries get hot, tanks and all the rest of it. It is very difficult, but it's long been sought after to remove ourselves from the battlefield. Which takes me back to, so on the battlefield, there are reports that the Russian T-14 Armata tank is in use. Again, this was a Russian source talking to Russian state media, so we've got to take it with a pinch of salt, and I will digest that salt in a moment, if I may. The source said that the T-14s have not yet participated in direct assault operations, but they have been fitted with extra protection on their flanks, and crews have undergone combat coordination, which I hope means training, or I presume means training. Now, British military intelligence said in January that Russian forces were reluctant to accept these tanks because of their poor condition, and described any deployment of the T-14s as a high-risk decision mainly taken for propaganda. They also went on, this is British MOD, saying that production is probably in the low tens. These things there's supposed to be 2,300 of these things by 2020, but production is probably in the low tens, and commanders are unlikely to trust the vehicle in combat. So allow me just to go back briefly. So Second Chechen War, 1999 and 2000, combat was very intensive in urban areas, and tanks are always vulnerable in urban areas because you can't cover a tank with armour. It just simply will not move. So you put the majority of the armour in the frontal arc. If a 60-degree arc, imagine standing on top of a tank and holding your arms out in front of you in a sort of V-shape formation. That's the frontal arc, and that's where all the armour is, on the front of the hull and the turret, and sort of the first third, if you like, down the flanks of the front of the vehicle. You can't put armour everywhere because, like I say, it just won't move. So they are very thin on top and at the back and under the belly. And in urban situations where soldiers can get on rooftops and elsewhere, bridges and what have you, and fire down onto tanks, they are extremely vulnerable from above. So Russia's experience of the Second Chechen War saw how they really were vulnerable in urban combat. That was then underlined in Georgia in 2008. They prevailed through mass, really. I mean, their equipment did not perform brilliantly. And then around about that time, 2008, Russia came out with these defence reforms called New Look, which was supposed to revamp the whole thing, and that was what kicked off this programme. So the Armata programme is tanks and an infantry vehicle, and I think there's an artillery piece in there as well, but started with great fanfare. But then you had the endemic corruption of the Russian system and the global financial crash in 2009. So the production of these tanks were heavily impacted by that, and like I say, they were eventually unveiled on the May the 9th parade, the Victory Day parade in Moscow in 2015, but we've never seen them since. And if there's a battalion's worth, if there are 100 of these things, I think that would be fanciful, and they're just not there. They are a bespoke item that they work for a bit and then break down and have to be sort of, it's very labour intensive to keep them going. On paper, they look terrific. They're supposed to have, or they do have, a 125mm smoothbore gun, but the turret is designed, and it's assessed that the turret design is such that it could take a 152mm gun if at some point. Now that would be, that's a huge weapon on a tank. It's also got a 7.62mm remote weapon station on the turret, an active protection system which can detect an incoming round and fire a projectile out at it. The sort of next layer of defence to try and stop things hitting the vehicle. The guide to tank warfare is don't be there, attack from a different flank. Don't be there, don't be seen. If you're seen, don't be hit. If you're hit, don't be penetrated. If you're penetrated, don't be killed if you're the crew members. So, you don't want the projectile to hit the turret, to hit the tank. If you can stop it getting near you, that's good. So these new active protection systems are almost like air defence, but on a micro scale. They detect stuff coming towards the tank and then fire projectiles at them to push them away. So it's got one of those. But most importantly, it's got a separate crew compartment. Still going with the 3-person crew, which is different to most Western armies have 4. But Russia uses an automatic loader for the gun, which is fine. You reduce the size of the vehicle and fewer people to have to look after and worry about and all the rest of it. But these things are quite temperamental. If you think about what it's got to do, select a round, shove it up the barrel, close the breech, etc., pretty technically confusing and difficult at the best of times, and that's before someone starts shooting at you. So They believe in these autoloaders. Fine, they've gone for this separate crew compartment at the front that's armoured. It separates them from the turret and all the explosives held in there. We've seen the T-72 turret throwing competition since February last year. So there's a lot of high explosive in that turret, and that doesn't mix well with the crew. So a separate crew compartment in these T-14s is one way of trying to protect them. And they are big. These things are comparable in size to a Western tank, an Abrams or a Challenger, Leopard 2, that kind of thing. It's about 50% bigger than a T-72. So great. They are fantastic on a factory forecourt or in the showroom coming to you soon. But they've not been proved reliable. It doesn't all work at the same time. We've not seen it beyond the training ground or the May Day parade with a massive logistic tail just around the corner. So whether or not they are able to cut the mustard in Ukraine, I'm very doubtful. And that's before you start trying to integrate them with all the other bits and pieces. I said Armata was a family. To give you an idea of how this program has suffered for love and money, basically. The T-15, which is an infantry fighting vehicle, that's nowhere. I mean, there's a couple of these things that were bespoke produced, but they're not running off in the numbers that they need to do under this new look program. So a very long-winded way of saying they might have this shiny new tank, but I think it's probably a bit rubbish, and it's never been used in combat properly before. And we wait and see. I'll take a little pause there.
Thank you very much, Dom. Francis Durnley, can I come to you next before we go to our guests? Francis, what are the latest diplomatic updates that you've been looking at?
Thanks, David. Well, the big news in the last couple of hours is that President Biden will be running for re-election. Now, I'm only going to reflect on this in the context of the war, whilst, of course, there's many different other reasons one would want to be covering this. Of course, to say that Biden has been robust on Ukraine would be an understatement. And so in the context of the war, this does really matter. The weapons, the billions of dollars of support, his symbolic visit to Kyiv, to offer just some examples. And if he wins, then one can expect that support to continue, given the way that Biden has defined this war as being about something more fundamental than only America's interests. And yet there are some this morning who are pro-Ukraine, who are, I think, quite concerned about this. With Biden running, a man for whom few Americans are that enthusiastic, it has to be said, according to polling, it does give the Republican Party an easier target. And there is some, given the vocal skepticism in the Republican Party about Ukraine, at least amongst the leadership, not necessarily amongst the grassroots, there is, I think, an anxiety that this might make a Republican victory more likely, and that having potentially big implications for Ukraine, particularly, of course, if Donald Trump were to win. But even Ron DeSantis, as question marks have been raised as to what his view on Ukraine really is, although the first signs are not necessarily positive. The other aspect of this, of course, is that it is risky for Biden to be choosing to run again. I mean, in the last campaign, it was a pretty unique set of circumstances. One reason, of course, being Trump, another being the fact that it was during a pandemic. He wasn't expected to be on the campaign tour, as it were, as much as one might normally be, and he will be the oldest president in American history in contesting this election. And so that might have implications. It may sharpen the mind amongst a certain core of American voters in a way that perhaps it hasn't yet, because he's not on the campaign trail. So it's an interesting set of circumstances, and I'm interested to hear listeners' perspectives on this. I did think it was interesting as well that one of the key phrases in the campaign launch video was, "As Americans, we believe in freedom and liberty, and we believe that our democracy will only ever be as strong as our willingness to fight for it." Now, this is obviously intended for a domestic audience, but it does have some resonance on an international level in the context of the shifting geopolitical plates caused by this war. So I thought that was quite interesting, and that'll be something that we'll come to, I'm sure, later on in the context of our guest today. Now, in other news, I did just want to draw attention to the fact that Sergei Lavrov has attended the UN in New York to chair 2 UN Security Council meetings. Now, Russia, of course, now have the presidency, as we've touched on in the past. And at one of these meetings, the UN Secretary General did sort of give him both barrels, say that Moscow's invasion is causing massive suffering and devastation to a country and its people. And yet the optics are still terrible. You've got Russia chairing these meetings. You've got Lavrov shaking hands with Antonio Guterres. It's not exactly the look of diplomatic isolation that the West sought to have with regard to Russia. And one can imagine the Ukrainian reaction. They're saying this is an impeccable hypocrisy. Lavrov chairs the UNSC, justifying war, mass killings, total destruction, and with international law. Russia must be designated a sponsor of terrorism and expelled everywhere. And an advisor to the Ukrainian president has called for Russia to be expelled everywhere. So it's not just sort of Ukrainian commentators that are saying this, is actually the Ukrainian government itself. So very strong words indeed. Now, staying with the UN briefly, the grain deal is still ongoing, frustrations around that. There's been a proposal to approve an extender deal, but Ukraine are saying that in order for that to take place, then there needs to be more pressure put on Russia. As we've spoken about in the past, Russia are using this as leverage, essentially, this grain deal, in order to keep them at the top table of international affairs. And Ukraine is saying you're going to have to be harder on them if you want things to improve, because at the moment, this is them using this as a means of getting hopefully the reduction of sanctions from their perspective, amongst other things. So that is still rumbling on, which is why I draw attention to it. Closer to home in Europe, the EU is giving a further tranche of 1.5 billion euros in macro financial assistance to Ukraine. Again, not anything new particularly, but whenever these things emerge, I think it's important to draw attention to them. The cost of this war is extraordinary. And I think I'm right in saying that when I think it was during the Falklands War, that Margaret Thatcher gave the advice to other leaders not to have a chancellor present in your war cabinet, because I don't think she did, because their eyes sort of bulge when they see how much war costs. And so it is just worth reiterating this, that this is costing Ukraine obviously an extraordinary amount of money, but just keeping its economy afloat is costing the world a large amount of money as well. And so it just is important because it has political consequences, as I say. And just finally, one very interesting story out of Australia. Australia is launching a major overhaul of its military, including accelerating plans to acquire the HIMARS, which of course will be familiar to listeners, this long-range missile system, to counter China's growing military prowess. So like Britain, they did a big strategic review. Now, Britain's was before Ukraine, of course, but this is now obviously during the war in Ukraine. And in a sense, they've reached pretty diametrically opposed conclusions. Britain before the war was talking about hybrid warfare, hybrid units, of course, the role of drones and technology, whereas this is almost a return, I would argue, to a sort of more conventional view of warfare, big heavy-duty weapons, mobilizing more forces, $1 billion program to develop howitzer artillery systems, being scrapped in favor of a brand new attempt to purchase 20 of the HIMARS, so a huge expansion, review of the defensive infrastructure, and really highlighting the importance of this moment for countries to reassess their strategic priorities. So they're saying this is now the largest and most ambitious of any country since the end of the Second World War in terms of the way in which they're thinking about this as a context of China's military build-up, and saying that Australia seeks to avoid the highest level of strategic risk we now face as a nation, the prospect of a major conflict in the region that directly threatens our national interest. The country cannot waste any more time when it comes to acquiring critical defence capabilities. That's according to the Australian Deputy Prime Minister. It also references the AUKUS deal, being the security partnership finalised between the US, the UK and Australia back in March, and then it will enable Australia to have nuclear-powered submarines. So a big reassessment, as I say, and I know we have a lot of Australian listeners, so very much welcome their reflections on this as well. But it's not just Europe that's considering its strategic priorities, David, it's the world. And that, of course, is going to be a subject that we'll discuss today.
Thank you very much, Francis and Dom. And Francis, what you just said, I think, leads us neatly to our guests, our colleague, South Asia correspondent Joe Wallen, and Tushar Shetty. Tushar and Joe, thank you so much for joining us. I mean, the first question, let's keep it very broad. How has the region you cover, South Asia, responded to the war in Ukraine? Is it a block? Can we describe it as such? And maybe just walk us through the important individual countries and their priorities. I don't know who would like to go first.
Sure, so I can jump in on this one if you like, David. Always a pleasure to join you on the podcast. So I think we can break it down somewhat. It's not just a sort of a block vote, as it were, but we can say generally across the region we've seen strategic ambivalence. So we haven't had one South Asian nation vote for or against Russia at the United Nations. Now we've seen different countries have got different priorities, but when we look at India, I guess the country that receives the most publicity when it comes to the Ukraine war. A lot of people expected India to kind of side with the West and side with the US when it comes to sanctions on Russia. India and the US overlap when it comes to a lot of Indo-Pacific policy. India's a member of the Quad with Australia, Japan, and the US. And India's biggest concern, something strategic or security concern, is China, as it is with Washington. But when it comes to Russia, they really do differ. India and Russia have, historic strategic relationships. And actually, India and Russia's trade has ballooned since the start of the war. And there's been a lot of reporting on oil trade, for example, and India's actually increased the amount of oil it imports from Russia by 22-fold since the start of the war, which is a really significant number. And the view from Delhi is that, look, it's a country that's rapidly industrializing. There's 400 million people being lifted out of poverty since the start of the millennium. And Russia offers India quite a whole host of financial economic opportunities, just as the US offers Delhi strategic opportunities in the region. So that's why we've seen fundamentally India abstain and maintain relations with both Russia and the US. And India is too much of an important partner for Washington to kind of receive or to kind of be sanctioned. And we've seen Ukraine call for sanctions on India because it's continued to import Russian oil. But the US simply can't afford to push India away. It is that key strategic partner in the region. Now, we've seen similar policies in Pakistan and Sri Lanka and Bangladesh. And now what we've got to understand is that countries in the region are really undergoing kind of a major economic crisis at the moment. Pakistan, probably the worst in its history. We've seen Sri Lanka go to the IMF last year after defaulting. Bangladesh also approaching the IMF. These are countries that are all major fuel and food importers. Cheap fuel from Russia is simply it's something that can't be turned down at this moment in time.
Thanks very much, Joe. Tushar, would you like to add to that?
Oh, yeah. Just like to add to that a little bit. I think the general opinion in South Asia is common to the global South, which is we've just come out of COVID and now there's another economic crisis. Export markets are down. So countries like Bangladesh and Sri Lanka that rely on tourists and textiles respectively are finding a tough time. Obviously, we see the debt issues. So there is a bit of, I don't want to say irritation, but sort of annoyance that like this is a crucial time and now Europe wants us to put on sanctions, which might impact our long-term recovery. But I think Joe can talk a little more about Pakistan. That's a very interesting political situation, which is affecting its whole diplomatic relations. But I do want to add that Russia is not just important to us economically. I think if we had to choose between the US and Russia, we choose US because it's more of a key partner in the long-term strategic situation with China. But I think that Russia has a UN veto, which we've consistently relied on. It's also willing to export a lot more defense equipment to us, especially sensitive technology, which the US is not really willing to do at this point. And historically, Russia has been more of a consistent ally. I mean, during the 1971 war, when the US sent the USS Enterprise to support Pakistan, the Russians sent a nuclear submarine to support us. You don't just throw allies away like that. So I think that's the situation India is facing right now.
Sorry, quickly, Tushar, who's us in that situation?
I'm Indian, so I meant India. I should be a little clear about that.
Before we get Joe to talk a little bit about Pakistan, can I ask you both, just in terms of the reporting on the war, what do civilians see on their televisions and read in their newspapers? Is it a particularly prominent piece of news across South Asia? And if it is reported, how is it reported?
It's a very good question, David. I mean, it's certainly something that we see on our TVs and radios here. I'd say the big angle that we see reported here is the impact, as I mentioned previously, the inflation that we're seeing, and record-breaking inflation in Bangladesh, in Pakistan, in Sri Lanka, which is in part being caused by the war itself. These are major, as I say, fuel and food importers. So that's been the biggest factor, I think, across the region. As Tushar mentioned, there was quite an angry statement this week from Nirmala Sitharaman, who's the economic or finance minister here in India, blaming kind of Western sanctions for the current economic crisis across the region. So there is anger here that, we've seen the price of flour, the price of rice, sunflower oil, cooking oil rise because of the war. We've just had Eid in Pakistan or across the region in India and Bangladesh. And it's been noticeable this year, families simply haven't been able to celebrate as usual. And the war's been a big impact on that. In terms of views amongst the public, I think that's one of the most interesting things here, and something that people don't always realize in the West, that according to the latest polls that we have, more Indian adults actually blame the US and NATO for the Ukraine war than Russia. And as Tushar mentioned there, India has a historic relationship with Russia, and there are also historic connotations as well, obviously with views of Western European countries being aggressors. But that's something that we don't see in the West, and something that I think has been missed by policymakers in the West, that actually in India, as I say, there's more sympathy for Russia amongst the public, according to the figures that we have, than the US or NATO.
Yeah, but the interesting thing to me is that it's very bipolar how the social media and journalists are covering this. Because on one end, Jaishankar, the foreign minister, is very popular by his, acerbic responses to Western journalists and diplomats. But on the other end, so it is sort of supporting the fact that we're taking our own independent stance against, Western preaching, so to speak. But on the other end, India is also kind of thrilled to be part of this sort of network of US alliances. I mean, Joe mentioned the Quad, but there's also I2U2, which is Israel, India, UAE, and US. So I think it's possibly because Modi has sort of taken this approach where he uses foreign policy successes as a way of raising his own domestic popularity, as a way of saying, hey, look at us, we're in the big boys club now, global powers are paying us respect. So I'm not going to say we're sympathetic to Russia. I don't think most Indians would be comfortable with the war in Ukraine and what's happening to Ukraine, but it's more of a thing of we're finally able to take our own stance in the world and people are paying us attention, if you get what I mean.
Can I ask you both just quickly? I mean, Joe, that stat there that you mentioned about people being favourable to Russia. What do you both think the West could do to change those views?
Just give India more attention, quite frankly. I think one of the things that India has been aiming for is a seat at the UN Security Council, a permanent seat with a veto. So I think the US and the West especially paying India more attention. And frankly, I guess the opinion here is Europe is being a bit preachy when it comes to Ukraine, because I think historian Stephen Courtney put it best. The violence that Europe is seeing in Ukraine hasn't been seen since 1945. But most countries in the global south, that's just another Wednesday. So India finds it most Indians find it kind of weird that Europeans are demanding that they pay so much attention to Ukraine when, for instance, we saw what happened in Afghanistan when the US just sort of abandoned that country. So more attention and more prestigious spots in global bodies, I'd say.
Thanks, Tushar. Joe?
More understanding, perhaps, of key priorities in the region. I mean, Tushar mentioned it earlier, but the reliance of the Indian army, the US sees India as a key military partner, strategic partner, but the reliance of India on Russian hardware is quite phenomenal. According to recent research, it's about 90% of army equipment, 70% of Air Force equipment comes from Russia. I know, for example, that the US gave India a bypass for buying kind of missile defense purchases from Russia, whereas it sanctioned Turkey because it views India as such an important partner. And I think sort of similar perks to that going forward, sharing of intelligence, which is something that we've seen from Moscow to Delhi in the past, could also, I think, warm relations, I think.
Joe, could I stay with you? Tushar mentioned you might be able to talk to us a little bit about Pakistan and its role in the region and its current politics and how the war has influenced that and how that might change Pakistan and the region. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So, I mean, Pakistan at this moment in time is really sort of undergoing its worst crisis really in living history. As I'm sure I've done a lot of reporting for the Telegraph on this. We've got a political crisis with Imran Khan very narrowly surviving the assassination attempt in the autumn. Possibly the worst economic crisis in the country's history. We did a report recently about how diabetics in the country simply can't afford medicine anymore, and people are dying because inflation is so severe. And then we're now seeing kind of a resurgence or return to insurgency in the northwest and west of the country. So for Pakistan, I think it's something that isn't so much of a priority really at the moment. I mean, the country is in such a difficult situation that what is going on in Ukraine is not top of the list. I mean, Pakistan has continued to export military hardware to Ukraine. It's got a historic relationship. It's about $1.6 billion worth of hardware that's exported to Ukraine since 2000. Then again, it's turned a blind eye. Again, it's abstained on voting at the UN because Pakistan is keen, due to its economic situation, to take advantage of the cheap fuel that is now on offer from Russia. So I think that's quite indicative of countries in the region. Again, Sri Lanka is another country that's taken advantage of that cheap fuel. It's these countries have their own problems at the moment. Off the back of COVID, off the back of gross macroeconomic mismanagement. Famously, Imran Khan, who was then the helm in Pakistan, was in Moscow the day that Russia invaded Ukraine. A lot was made of that. It wasn't great optics for Mr. Khan at the time either. But yes, certainly. I mean, I think Islamabad has got a foot in both camps feet in both camps as well.
Yeah, and what's interesting is that also the statement that he made when the Taliban took over Kabul, which is the Afghans have thrown away the chains of slavery, which is interesting for a country that is supposedly a US ally. I think we did a podcast in Pakistan a couple of weeks ago, and one of the views was that one of the reasons that the army and the generals decided that Imran Khan couldn't continue in power was that he was too aggressively against the US. He was making a lot of, let's say, politically unwise statements against the US. And let's remember that Pakistan is still very dependent on the US for aid, for previously military aid, and also bailouts from the IMF, which they believe the US can influence. So I think the army and the current the current government are trying to repair relations with the United States, while Imran Khan seems to want to go in a different direction, and he might just come back to power in October.
I was going to say one key thing to add, I think, as well, certainly from both an Indian and Pakistani perspective, is that Russia is also a key partner or ally when it comes to, I mean, India. There's a lot of concern in Delhi at the moment about the return of the Taliban, the fact that the Taliban have failed to enforce kind of de facto control over the country. We've seen weapons flow from Afghanistan through Pakistan into Kashmir in India. And so it's totally in India's strategic interest as well to kind of maintain the relation with Russia and with Moscow, to speak with the Taliban. That's very much a regional interest, which is something, again, in the West that I think people have missed.
One thing I'd like to ask you both is, often the invasion of the war in Ukraine is described as a sort of, a colonial war, a neo-colonial war. Russia, the imperial power, attempting to take over a country that once was its imperial subject. Does that not speak to the South Asian experience at all? I mean, you mentioned the historic ties with Russia, but is there not an emotional or a sort of emotional connection with what Ukraine is experiencing?
Not really in that sense, which is surprising because I was in Berlin when the invasion happened, and it's interesting to note the contrast between the reactions in Europe and in South Asia. I think for India, especially, what was a big moment was, so there are two factors. One of them is that I think for India especially, we were very focused on China, and honestly, the Ukraine war is a bit of I don't want to say distraction, it's tragic, but it is sort of a thing that's away from our strategic space. And secondly, when Afghanistan fell and the US sort of, exited that quickly, it was a bit more of a shock to us. So with now the US providing billions and billions in aid to Ukraine, with Europe sort of, deciding to cut off oil and gas imports from Russia and thereby increasing the commodity prices globally because they're tapping into different markets, it creates a different set of problems for us. And like I said, I mean, this region's seen a lot of historic violence. It just doesn't impact or shock us the way it might shock a lot of Europeans and Americans.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it can't be stressed enough, how I think for a lot of people perhaps still watching from the West, they consider maybe Pakistan as India's big security threat, but it's simply not the case anymore. And, eyes are very much northwards. We've had regular Chinese incursions into Indian territory. You've done a lot of reporting about this at the Telegraph in Ladakh, in Arunachal Pradesh. So Tushar says, this is part of the reason also why Delhi is keen to keep Russia on side, because it views Russia as perhaps one of the few countries that has some leverage with China and that can perhaps kind of cool Chinese aggression along the Indian border. It's a total focus on Beijing here now in Delhi, I would say. As Tushar says, the war in Ukraine is a long way from India's strategic sphere. The big impact here really is on living standards, is on inflation, with eyes on China.
Well, that would be actually my final question before I hand over to Dom and Francis. As you mentioned, Joe, China is the sort of great geopolitical supermassive black hole in the region. How has China's actions and positions on the Ukraine war sort of shifted or changed how South Asia understands it? I'm asking because our foreign correspondent James Kilner talks about Central Asia, and he says, really, because of China's geopolitical might, when China leans one way or leans the other, the rest of Central Asia has to sit up and sort of take notice. Is that the same in South Asia?
I would say not really. I think, especially for India, China is much more of a longer-term strategic problem, and its position towards specifically the Ukraine war, it doesn't directly impact the view here towards China. I mean, there are a lot of bodies. So, for instance, there was a BRICS summit recently. I think President Lula of Brazil is, trying to create some sort of a alternative body in that. We're hosting the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit, which is basically Russia, China, Central Asian countries, and Pakistan, India. That's happening in Goa. So that's sort of the rival to, I don't know, G20 or something to that extent. So there's no direct change in India's response. To my extent, Joe might have a different opinion. But to the extent that it's causing the US, let's say, to impose sanctions on China, or sort of jiggle the supply chain, like the CHIPS Act, which might benefit us, I don't think that's changing the position, at least for India, much on its relations with China.
Oh, I was just going to say, yeah, I think, as I said, economics is the big priority for countries in the region. I think certainly from a Pakistani point of view, and Sri Lankans an enormous debt to China, so there isn't much sort of wiggle room in terms of kind of going against Chinese policy, whether it be on Russia, Ukraine, or more broadly. But as Tushar says, India, certainly in Delhi, China is the long-term security concern for sure.
Thank you very much, Tushar and Joe. Francis Sterney, I think you have a question.
Thanks. Yes, thank you both very much for your time today. My first question is relating to a point you made earlier about how to try and shift the dial in a more sort of pro-Ukrainian direction in these countries. One could even go as far as say pro-Western direction in these countries. And you said paying them more attention. And I can totally accept that it's important to maintain strong ties with those who are perhaps on the fence and perhaps even stronger ties. But I wonder if there's another side to this, which is actually making it clear the consequences of supporting Russia and China in this context around the world and with everything that's shifting at the moment. And so I just wondered whether there is sort of again, to return to the maxim I keep repeating all the time, which is, you've got to carry a big stick, talk nicely and carry a big stick. Do we need to use a stick as well as talking nicely?
Sure, so I can jump in on this one. I mean, I think times have simply changed, and I think it's something that's being missed in the West. India is now the world's fifth biggest economy. It's overtaken the UK. I don't think London is the one to be wielding the stick, certainly at the moment. I mean, when it comes to, the UK is desperate really for this trade deal with India, certainly when it comes to a British perspective. And then when we look at, the US, for example, India is the US's key partner in South Asia when it comes to balancing China. And we've already seen the US give India a really wide berth when it comes to kind of buying Russian hardware, whereas it's punished other countries in NATO. I gave the example of Turkey earlier. So India is in this unusually, it's quite unique geopolitical position where it can kind of play both sides, because both sides need India. The US can't afford to push India away. And the argument from Modi and other Indian politicians is that the country should be allowed to develop, and that while it shares these kind of Indo-Pacific strategic goals with the US, as I say, with China, that actually in Ukraine they differ, and that India's relationship with Russia kind of predates its kind of current strong ties with the US, really.
Yeah, and I think just to add to that, I think we all sort of understand what happened when China tried to do that, with this whole wolf warrior diplomacy strategy. It kind of pushed a lot of countries that were on the fence about China, maybe had good relations, more towards the US camp. Just remember, the media here is pretty lively. And if Western countries try imposing sanctions or trying to bully India into supporting its position, I'm not sure it would reap dividends, at least in my view.
Thank you. I thought you might say that. And just the last question from me, which is, I think it's just very helpful to give listeners a sense of how these countries think of Western countries. So if I were to ask you, I know this is a cruel question because it depends on who you're talking about within these respective countries, but let's say, we here in London talk about sort of the elite perspective or the establishment. The establishment in these countries, what do they think of, say, America, Britain, France? I mean, what comes to mind for them? And is it more positive or is it more negative?
Yeah, I'd say there's been a real. I mean, I'm sure Tushar will agree with me. There's a real surge in nationalism in India for sure. Certainly, I've been here 4 or 5 years, and I've really noticed an uptick since Modi was re-elected in 2019. There's a real sense that Modi often says this is India's century, and there's a view now that the West needs India more than India needs the West, and there's a lot of evidence to suggest that. I think, there are still, it's important to have positive relations. We talk a lot about Indian workers in the UK or getting Indian workers in the US kind of ample visas. Trade is really important. I do think Delhi is keen for, to negotiate this trade deal just as much as London is. But certainly the sort of sands have shifted in the last 5 or 10 years, or even the last year or two. Yeah, so I do think it is a time of geopolitical change for sure for countries like India, for Pakistan, for Sri Lanka, for Bangladesh. Bangladesh has undergone a huge, or certainly until recently, it's been a huge economic success story, and countries are really courting Bangladesh now for investment. Yeah, I'm not sure what you think on that one, Tushar. Do you agree with me? But I think there's been a real surge in nationalism here, certainly in India.
Yeah, but the one thing that surprised me, especially doing the podcast about Pakistan, was how virulently anti-American Pakistanis are. I mean, it's worse than their opinion of India. And I was surprised that it's a thing where if, leaders there sort of are seen closing up too much to America, they're sort of brought down by like opposition politicians, which is quite surprising. As for India, I think generally speaking, we have a generally positive opinion about America. Luckily, they didn't press too hard in like sanctions or forcing India to stop buying oil from Russia. Britain, it's kind of like it's gone down. Let me put it that way. Particularly since Brexit and the chaos over there. The one surprising thing I found, there's a surprisingly negative opinion about Germany, of all countries, more so than France. I think France and India have better defense ties because it's sort of seen like Germany is a country that is leading the, I don't know, I've sensed that if in Europe there's irritation towards Germany, not too much towards Britain or France, and generally positive relations with the US. Like I said, the main focus is China. So
thanks, everybody. Dom Nichols, anything from you?
Yeah, got a couple, if I may. Hi, Joe. Hi, Tushar. Thanks so much for joining us. I was struck by your comments just now about the sense of geopolitical change and momentum shifting to South Asia. And in particular, that stat you gave earlier on, that the Indian import of Russian oil has gone up 20-fold, which could be good business. Well, it is good business from India's point of view. But I just wonder if there's a sense of that is taking advantage of a weakened Russia, and if there's any sense at all in South Asia, possibly of the shine coming off the Russian brand.
It's a really good question, Dom, actually. And so for the first time this year, I think 20 years, Russia has, in 2021-22, Russia was no longer India's largest arms importer. It was France. India signed that kind of very high-profile deal for the Rafale jets. Apologies for my pronunciation there. And I think the war in Ukraine, the sense here is that we're now shifting to seeing kind of imports of military hardware from the US and from France, from the UK, more expensive hardware, but better quality hardware. And there are concerns off the back of the Ukraine war that some of this Russian hardware isn't perhaps what it was sold to be, or isn't as good as it was supposed to be. But the tricky thing is that because so much of the Indian Armed Forces uses Russian hardware, at least for the next kind of decade or so, they're going to have to kind of rely on sort of replace parts from Russia. But one issue that they are having at the moment is there's about $2 billion worth of Russian military hardware, which is currently held up from arriving in India due to sanctions that have been imposed on Russia. There's currently a free trade agreement talk between Delhi and Moscow, and part of the priority from the Indian side is to negotiate trades in rupees, which will allow some of this military hardware to then arrive in the country. But I think you're right when we say that there is some of the shine that's come off, certainly when it comes to military imports from Russia, I'd say.
Thanks. And I was going to ask actually how happy India seems to be with its reliance on Russian military equipment. I think you've kind of answered that one very nicely there. Thanks. So just one final one for me, please. We hear about or rather, it's been a little while actually since I've caught up with the Chinese plan, the String of Pearls, as it was known, the naval bases and increased maritime presence around the Indian Ocean and the coastline of Pakistan and elsewhere. I just wonder if you could update us on where that project is. I wonder if it's sort of stalled a little bit like the Belt and Road.
Yeah, I was just going to say that I think just obviously because of some slowed growth in China and the pace of investment in those ports in Bangladesh and Myanmar and Pakistan isn't as quick as it used to be. I mean, there was a story recently, which I'm not sure if you guys are following. It's a Chinese engineer was arrested under the blasphemy law. I believe it was in Gwadar. So, and you're also finding a lot of Chinese investments are sort of becoming unviable. They're leading to high debt burdens. So, I'm not sure how effective China is, how much China is pushing this strategy anymore. I'm sure because of collapsing domestic growth, it has other priorities. But it does seem that the hunger for Chinese investment isn't as high as it used to be around the Indian Ocean region. What do you think, Joe?
Yeah, so certainly. I mean, Sri Lanka's economic collapse. It's still, despite having the IMF bailout, has got the biggest inflation or the largest inflation in Asia. The statistics are still shocking. Save the Children had a report recently. It's around half of families, skipping meals, and this is a country of 22 million. This proportion of that debt that Sri Lanka owes was to China. Similarly in Pakistan, which again is now negotiating an IMF bailout. Yeah, I'd say I'd stop short of saying there's kind of public anger towards China. Like, we haven't seen sort of mass protests, but certainly I think there's been a bit of a coming to senses of this Chinese debt and what it means for countries long term. I think what's interesting in Pakistan is that we've seen kind of a recent string of attacks on Chinese nationals in Pakistan, particularly in Balochistan, the Balochistan province in the west of the country, which has had a long sort of pro-independence insurgency. And the view there is, Tushar mentioned, the porting in Gwadar, that kind of all this Chinese investments come into the country and come into the region, but very little of it is trickling down to Pakistani citizens or citizens in Balochistan. So I certainly think there has been a coming to senses in the region. I mean, Nepal is a good example that really pivoted towards China and now seems to be somewhat in the middle again between India and China in terms of its policy, and where it's looking for kind of financial support and aid. Again, Nepal and Bhutan have both had Chinese incursions on their territory in the last couple of years that have been quite widely reported. So I think there is this kind of growing concern about Chinese aggression in the region as well. And countries are quite nervous. I think certainly politicians in Kathmandu, there's very little, what can they do when faced with a country as powerful as China? It's just, I'd say certainly rising nerves about Chinese aggression and coming to senses about some of this debt for sure.
Well, thank you, Joe and Tushar. It's been absolutely fascinating hearing your thoughts, and thank you so much for joining us there. We'll come back to you for your final thoughts, and let's bring it back, of course, to Ukraine. So, Dom or Francis, who wants to go first? What are your final thoughts from today? I mean, we're very curious to see your reaction to some of the things Tushar and Joe have been speaking about.
Thanks, David. I just reflect on when we talk about the international community or the international rule-based order, that we are quite often talking about quite a narrow pool of countries who really firmly subscribe to that, whether that be within the European context and America. But actually, when you're looking at countries like the ones we've discussed today, they are less fixed in terms of perhaps the ideological prism that one would subscribe to, perhaps, and more in thinking in terms of their own interests. And I don't say that with malice, I just say that as a political reality. And it does mean that we need to think very carefully about how we engage with these countries. And I think, broadly speaking, of course, we have, the West, when I say we, have tended to be rather naive in terms of how we've dealt with these countries. And Russia and China have been less so. And it's now paying dividends for them in the context of this war and also the trade relations that they've been fostered between them. So that's my sort of reflection on the conversation we've had today. And it is, of course, very important as we think about the broader implications strategically of the shifting geopolitical plates as a consequence of this war, and particularly what's happening in the Pacific relating to China as well. But my final thought is very short today, you'll be pleased to hear, which is, we're talking about Biden's announcement that he's running for re-election. And I just wanted to flag for our American listeners that we have just launched on a sort of American version of our website. So if you go on www.telegraph.co.uk, it'll automate to a US version of what we produce. So you'll see more political comment from us and a more foreign policy announcement, as well as news stories specifically commissioned for an American audience. So, of course, we've always been producing things for an international audience, but this is to give American readers, obviously, at a very interesting time, a particular portal for them to see our coverage. So we're obviously very grateful to our American cousins for your continued support of the podcast, but hopefully this is something quite exciting that you'll be able to appreciate and see, and it expands our coverage to you. So watch this space. Hopefully there'll be more to come.
Thank you, Francis. Dom Nichols.
Yeah, thanks, David. I would just go back to the point that Joe and Tushar were making earlier on about the I mean, ambivalence is too strong a word, but this idea that there are many, many areas of the world that think that the West, US and Western European, the external supporters for Ukraine, only really to pay attention to big conflicts and these clashes when it's close to home. And there's probably something in that needs to be explored. And the reason I raise that is because you can bet your bottom ruble that Russia is going to be exploring that. If you look at Lavrov in the UN Security Council, he is trying to say it's situation normal. We're here. It's our rotating. We're the chair of the rotating presidency of the UN Security Council. We're not going anywhere. You need to start realising that you've got to come and work with us. In fact, you need to realise the error of your ways. And I suggest you start saying sorry to Putin now before you make him any more angry. I mean, that's the kind of thing they're trying to say. It's situation normal. They're not going anywhere. And they are going to appeal. Russia will appeal to the UN General Assembly, where everyone gets a vote, and to those parts of the world who aren't as invested in Ukraine as some perhaps closer to it, or with more view on the values at risk. And I think it would be interesting to see the fallout from the General Assembly, if there's any at all, or those other nations around the world that aren't on the UN Security Council, their response to Sergei Lavrov's chairing of these two meetings. Because I think for all the ill, I'm not a big fan of the United Nations in its current guise. It's the sort of least bad system we have at the moment, and they will play it for all they can, and we just need to guard that. But let's start by, or guard against that. But let's start by taking notice of what is said, or perhaps more importantly, what is not said, from all those other countries around the world.
Thanks, Dom and Francis. Joe and Tusha, as our guests, would you like the very final words? If you could sum up your points today, that would be great. Or at least, give us a sense of, how this might change in the future and what we really should be looking out for.
I just want to add one last point as to the future outlook of this. I think there was a Singaporean diplomat called Bilhari Kausikan who had a very interesting perspective of this. And he said a lot of the smaller states and larger states in the global south, they don't necessarily want to return to a Cold War situation where it's either the US or China. I think what they would prefer is a sort of multipolar order, not necessarily in the way that the Russians are preaching it, but where they have a choice of different partners and countries to work with. So to people in the West who are kind of surprised at, some of the positions from the global South, I'd say this. I think India at least is much more a Western ally than you guys might think. I think in the long term, that's the direction we're heading in. And I think there just has to be a more proactive strategy to engage the global South in the way that China has, for instance, by infrastructure projects, etc. So, the future isn't all that grim.
Yeah, I think as Tushar says, for countries in the region, certainly a multipolar world is something that's spoken about regularly. I mean, we had Jai Shankar, who's India's foreign minister, earlier, at the end of last week, describing the relationship between India and Russia as one of the world's steadiest economic relationships. And I think that caused a lot of surprise in the West, but for people, or for us in India, it's not so much of a surprise. And I think countries are enjoying the ability to choose strategic partners as and when it suits them. But I do agree with Tushar that kind of heightened Chinese aggression, certainly in the Indo-Pacific, will definitely push India more towards the West. Pakistan, difficult to say. I mean, the country's in so much debt to China that it is, we do hear the word sort of satellite state banded around. But certainly, India is in this unique geopolitical position, and this powerful position that India now occupies, where it can court the West, it can court Russia, it's something that's only going to increase, I would say, in the years to come.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Or sign up to Dispatches, our Ukraine newsletter, which brings stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a Ukraine live blog on our website where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload, so if you want to hear Ukraine the Latest as soon as it is released, do refer to podcast apps. If you enjoyed this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app. And if you have a moment, leave a review, as it helps others find the show. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do read every message. And you can contact us directly on Twitter. You can find our Twitter handles in the description for this episode. Ukraine the Latest is produced by Louisa Wells and Giles Gear, and today on Twitter, Rachel Duffy.